An American soldier stands at a pontoon bridge. His rifle hangs loose. Across the water, 300 German civilians wait in silence. April 25, 1945. The Elbe River. The war is ending, but the dying has not stopped. This is the story of how ordinary American soldiers chose conscience over command and saved thousands of lives their allies demanded they surrender. April 24, 1945, 1700 hours. Technical Sergeant Frank Morrison of the 69th Infantry Division stood at the eastern bank of the Elbe River and watched a woman carry a dead child toward the water. The child's arm hung at an angle that made his stomach turn. The woman's face held no expression. She simply walked, one foot before the other, toward the American position. Morrison's hands tightened on his M1 Garand rifle. He had carried this weapon across France, through the Siegfried Line, into the heart of Germany itself. He had fired it at men who wore the same uniform as the corpses now lining the roads behind the refugee column. But the woman with the dead child wore no uniform. She wore a house dress that might once have been blue. Behind her stretched a line of humanity that disappeared into the smoke of burning villages. Thousands, children clutching older children's hands, old men pushing wheelbarrows loaded with nothing but blankets, women carrying infants wrapped in newspapers. They moved west with the desperate single-mindedness of animals fleeing fire. Sarge. Private Eddie Wilkins appeared at Morrison's elbow, his voice cracked on the single word. "What do we do?" Morrison had no answer. The question hung between them like the smoke that drifted across the river, thick, choking, impossible to ignore. The orders were clear. The demarcation line between American and Soviet zones ran down the center of the Elbe. Any German military personnel attempting to cross were to be detained and handed to Soviet forces. Civilians were to be stopped, documented, and returned to their zones of origin. The agreement had been signed at Yalta. The ink was barely dry. But the woman kept walking toward the water. 6 weeks earlier, Morrison had believed he understood this war. The enemy wore field gray. They spoke German. They served a regime whose crimes had been documented in camp after camp, town after town, witness after witness. The moral calculus was simple. You fought them. You defeated them. You went home. Then the 69th Infantry Division reached Torgau on April 25th, and everything Morrison thought he understood shattered like glass under a rifle butt. The first Soviet soldiers arrived at 1500 hours. They came in trucks that belched black smoke, wearing uniforms that looked assembled from a dozen different supply depots. Some had boots, others wrapped their feet in rags. But every man carried a weapon, and every weapon was loaded. Captain James Harwood of Company C shook hands with a Soviet major whose name Morrison never learned. The major smiled. His teeth were steel. He spoke through an interpreter, a thin woman in a Red Army uniform, who translated Russian into heavily accented English. "We are allies," the major said through the interpreter. "Together, we have crushed the fascist beast." Harwood nodded. He was 26 years old, a schoolteacher from Iowa who had learned Russian from a phrase book during the Atlantic crossing. "Together," he repeated in fractured Russian. The major's smile widened. Then he turned and looked at the refugee column that stretched along the eastern bank. His smile disappeared. "These people belong to the Soviet zone of occupation," he said through the interpreter. "They must be returned." Harwood's face remained neutral. "They're civilians, Major, women and children. They are German citizens who fled from liberated territory. Some may be war criminals. Others may be collaborators. They must be processed by Soviet authorities." The word processed landed between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Morrison watched this exchange from 20 feet away. He was close enough to see Harwood's jaw tighten, close enough to see the Soviet major's hand rest on his holstered pistol, close enough to understand that something was about to break in a way that orders and regulations could never repair. "We'll need time to verify their status," Harwood said finally. The Soviet major stared at him. 5 seconds. 10. Then he nodded once and walked back to his truck. When the Soviets were gone, Harwood turned to Morrison. "Get the boats ready," he said quietly. "All of them." Morrison blinked. "Sir." "The pontoon boats, Sergeant. Get them in the water. We're going to need them for engineering purposes." The captain's eyes held Morrison's. In that gaze, Morrison saw something he had never expected to find at the end of a war fought for clear moral principles, ambiguity, fear, and underneath both, a decision already made. "Yes, sir," Morrison said. By nightfall, Company C had deployed 6 pontoon boats at the crossing point. Officially, they were conducting river depth surveys. Officially, they were preparing for potential bridge construction. Officially, they were following standard post-combat engineering protocols. Unofficially, Morrison and 32 other men spent the night ferrying German civilians across the Elbe. The first boat carried 12 people, a grandmother who clutched a photograph album, 2 children under the age of 5, a pregnant woman who went into labor halfway across. Morrison delivered the baby with hands that had learned field medicine from a manual and desperation. The infant was a girl. She was silent when she emerged, and Morrison thought she was dead until she opened her mouth and screamed with a fury that seemed to reject the entire universe that had brought her into being on a pontoon boat in the middle of a river at night. The mother wept. Morrison wrapped the baby in his own jacket and placed her in her mother's arms. The boat reached the western bank. The family disappeared into the darkness toward the processing centers that Morrison knew would delay their documentation for days, long enough for them to be firmly established as prisoners of the American Army rather than Soviet returnees. The second boat carried 30. They squeezed together until Morrison feared the pontoon would capsize. It held. The third boat carried German soldiers still in uniform, too wounded to remove their tunics. Morrison took their weapons and tossed them into the river. He took their identification papers and burned them. He took their names and wrote nothing down. "You are prisoners of war of the United States Army," he told them in the German he had learned from captured soldiers during the long advance. "Do you understand?" They understood. Their eyes held the light of men who had been shown an unlocked door in a burning building. By 0300 hours, Morrison had lost count of the crossings. The numbers blurred into a stream of faces, hands, voices speaking German that ranged from educated Berlin accents to peasant dialects he could barely parse. They all said the same thing in different words. "Please, please, please." He said nothing. He simply kept loading boats. When the Soviet major returned at 0800 hours, he brought 40 soldiers and 3 trucks. Morrison was at the crossing point, securing the 6th pontoon boat after its latest trip. His uniform was soaked through. His hands were raw from rope burns. He had not slept in 28 hours. The major stepped out of the lead truck. His steel teeth were not smiling. "You have been busy, Sergeant," he said through his interpreter. Morrison straightened. Every instinct screamed at him to reach for his rifle. But his rifle was leaning against a tree stump 15 feet away, and the Soviet soldiers already had their weapons unslung. "Engineering work, sir," Morrison said. "Captain's orders. Engineering." The major walked to the water's edge. He looked at the pontoon boat, then at the muddy tracks leading up the western bank where hundreds of refugees had passed during the night. Interesting engineering. Behind Morrison, Private Wilkins stood frozen. Morrison could hear the kids breathing, short, shallow, terrified. The major turned back to Morrison. "The agreement specifies that German military personnel in the Soviet zone of occupation are to be handed over to Soviet command." "Yes, sir." "You are preventing this." "No, sir. We are processing prisoners of war in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Once processed, they will be transferred to the appropriate authorities through proper channels." The words sounded hollow even to Morrison's ears. The major's face confirmed it. He stepped closer until Morrison could smell tobacco and something else, something that might have been vodka or might have been fear masked by aggression. "Proper channels," the major repeated. "How long does this processing require?" Morrison met his eyes. "As long as necessary, sir." 5 seconds. 10. The river ran between them, but the real divide was measured in decisions made in darkness, in boats loaded with people who had no right to mercy under any document signed by any government. Then the major stepped back. "You are making a mistake, Sergeant. These people are not your concern. They are German. They are enemy. Why do you care what happens to them?" Morrison had no answer prepared. The question struck something deeper than training, deeper than orders, deeper than the clear moral lines that had brought him across the Atlantic. When he spoke, the words came from a place he had not known existed. "Because I saw a woman carrying a dead child," he said, "and she looked like my mother." The silence that followed held the weight of collapsed civilizations. The Soviet major left. His trucks rumbled back toward Torgau, but Morrison knew they would return. The pressure would increase. The demands would become ultimatums. The ambiguous space where conscience could operate would narrow and close. Captain Harwood assembled Company C at 1000 hours. 63 men stood in the ruins of a farmhouse courtyard. They were exhausted, filthy, and utterly unprepared for what their captain was about to ask them to do. "We have a problem," Harwood said. His voice was steady, but Morrison saw his hand shake. "The Soviets want us to hand over every German soldier and potential collaborator who crosses to our side. Our orders support this. The Yalta agreement requires it." He paused. Morrison watched several men look at their boots. "But I have seen what happens to people sent back," Harwood continued. "I have spoken to refugees who describe conditions in the Soviet zone that violate every principle we supposedly fought this war to defend. And I have reached a decision." Another pause, longer this time. "We are going to delay compliance with the repatriation orders. We are going to continue processing prisoners at a pace that ensures they remain in American custody until the political situation clarifies. We are going to use every bureaucratic loophole, every administrative delay, every technical requirement we can invent." Harwood's eyes scanned the assembled men. "This is not an order. I cannot order you to violate the letter of our agreements with the Soviets. Any man who wants no part of this can report to the command post and request reassignment. No questions asked, no consequences." Nobody moved. "However," Harwood said, and now his voice took on an edge Morrison had never heard before, "any man who chooses to participate must understand the risks. We may face courts-martial. We may face diplomatic consequences. We may face Soviet retaliation. What we will not face is the knowledge that we stood by while thousands of people were sent to their deaths because a map drawn by politicians said they were on the wrong side of a river." Wilkins raised his hand. His voice shook when he spoke. "Sir, what about the dead child?" Harwood blinked. "What?" "Sergeant Morrison said he saw a woman carrying a dead child. Is that child still at the crossing point?" Morrison felt something crack inside his chest. He had not mentioned the woman to anyone except the Soviet major. But Wilkins had been there. Wilkins had seen. "No," Morrison said quietly. "We buried her. Western Bank. Grid reference 3742. "Then she's on our side now," Wilkins said. "Seems to me that makes her our responsibility." The logic was absurd. The sentiment was perfect. Morrison saw Harwood's face shift, the schoolteacher from Iowa recognizing that his men had already made their choice before he offered them the option to refuse. "Then we're agreed," Harwood said. "Dismissed. And gentlemen, if this goes wrong, I will testify that I gave direct orders and you followed them. That's on me, not you." The men dispersed. Morrison remained. "You think this will work, sir?" he asked. Harwood looked at the river. "No," he said simply, "but I think we have to try." Over the next 11 days, Company C of the 69th Infantry Division became expert at creative bureaucracy. Processing forms were filled out in triplicate, then lost, then recreated with minor errors that required additional review. Medical examinations were thorough to the point of absurdity. Every refugee received dental checks, vision tests, and psychological evaluations that took hours. Transportation schedules were constantly revised due to fuel shortages and mechanical difficulties. Prisoner transfer rosters were prepared, submitted, and returned for clarification of individual status. Morrison became fluent in delay. He learned that a sympathetic medic could find legitimate health concerns in almost any exhausted refugee. He learned that properly motivated supply clerks could lose documents with remarkable consistency. He learned that the chaos of a collapsing nation provided perfect cover for men willing to use that chaos to save lives. The refugees kept coming. By May 1st, Company C had ferried more than 4,000 people across the Elbe. Most were civilians. Hundreds were German soldiers who had shed their uniforms but not their fear. All of them whispered the same stories, stories of Soviet occupation troops who made no distinction between Wehrmacht soldiers and SS officers, between Nazi Party members and conscripted factory workers, between guilt and proximity to guilt. Morrison heard these stories during processing interviews. He recorded none of them. Official documentation stated that refugees were being held for security verification and proper classification in accordance with Allied Control Council directives. Unofficial reality was that Company C was running an underground railroad across a river instead of through the American South, and the cargo was German instead of African American, but the moral architecture was identical. On May 3rd, a woman arrived at the crossing point pushing a wheelchair. The chair held a man in his 70s, skeletal and gray. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow. Morrison thought he was dying. "My father," the woman said in German. "He was a judge in Königsberg. He never joined the party. Never." He refused. They sent him to Sachsenhausen. The Soviets liberated the camp. They said he was free. Then they arrested him again. They said all German judges were war criminals. They said there would be a trial. She stopped. Her hands gripped the wheelchair handles until her knuckles went white. "There will be no trial," she said. "Please, he has days, maybe hours. Let him die on the western side. Let him die believing justice still exists somewhere." Morrison looked at the man in the wheelchair. The man's eyes opened. They were blue and clear, and held the terrible wisdom of someone who had seen civilizations collapse and understood that the collapse was never complete, that small acts of decency could survive even in the ruins. "What was your father's name?" Morrison asked. "Heinrich Adler." Morrison wrote nothing down. He would write nothing down, but he would remember the name Heinrich Adler for the rest of his life, because remembering was the only testimony he could offer. "Get in the boat," he said. The confrontation came on May 7th, 1945. Germany surrendered at 0241 hours Central European Time. By 0800, the Soviet major was back at the Elbe crossing point with 200 soldiers and an NKVD commissar whose face could have been carved from Ural granite. Captain Harwood met them on the western bank. Morrison stood 3 steps behind him with his rifle unslung. 30 men from Company C formed a loose perimeter. They were outnumbered 6-1. Nobody mentioned this fact aloud. The commissar spoke through the interpreter. His Russian was clipped, precise, the language of a man accustomed to obedience enforced through terror. "The war in Europe is over. The German Reich has surrendered unconditionally. All territories designated as the Soviet occupation zone must be evacuated of American personnel within 72 hours. All German prisoners of war and displaced persons currently in American custody must be transferred to Soviet control immediately." Harwood nodded. "We will comply with all properly authorized directives through appropriate military channels." I am the appropriate military channel. NKVD authority supersedes all other considerations in the Soviet zone. This is the American zone, Commissar. The river is the demarcation line. These people are on our side. The Commissar's face showed nothing. They crossed from Soviet territory. They belong to Soviet jurisdiction regardless of their current location. That's not how the agreement works. That is precisely how the agreement works when I say it does. Morrison watched this exchange like a man watching a cliff begin to crumble. He could see the end point: violence, death. the careful house of cards that Company C had built collapsing in a burst of gunfire and diplomatic disaster. But Harwood did not blink. "You want these prisoners," the captain said. "File the transfer request through Allied Control Council protocols. Provide documentation specifying charges against individuals. Follow the established procedures for prisoner exchange as outlined in the Geneva Convention and ratified by all signatory powers, including the Soviet Union. We do not need permission to reclaim our own territory. You do, when that territory is behind American lines and under American military authority. Sir." The word "sir" hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in courtesy. The commissar stepped forward. Morrison's finger moved to his trigger. Every man in Company C shifted stance simultaneously, not raising weapons, not making threats, simply existing in a new configuration that suggested things would go very badly for everyone if anyone moved wrong. "You are protecting war criminals," the commissar said. "I'm protecting prisoners of war who have surrendered to American forces and are entitled to treatment in accordance with international law." There were SS officers in that group, Gestapo, men with blood on their hands. "Then charge them. Document their crimes. Submit evidence. We'll hold a tribunal." We do not need tribunals for fascists. And there it was, the fundamental divide laid bare. Morrison understood in that moment that the argument was never about jurisdiction or procedure or proper channels. It was about whether human beings had rights that existed independent of state power, whether mercy was possible in a world that had just witnessed industrialized genocide, whether the men who had fought totalitarianism could resist becoming totalitarian themselves. Harwood understood it too. Morrison saw it in the way his captain's shoulders straightened. "Nevertheless," Harwood said, "that is how we operate. If you want these prisoners, follow the process. If you want to contest American authority in the American zone, take it up with General Bradley. Until then, this crossing is closed." The commissar stared at him. The Soviet soldiers raised their weapons. 30 American rifles rose in response. The Elbe ran between them, indifferent to the human drama unfolding on its banks. Then the Soviet major spoke. He addressed the commissar in Russian. Morrison could not understand the words, but he understood tone. The major was not arguing. He was warning. The commissar listened. His face showed nothing. When the major finished, the commissar nodded once and turned back to his truck. "This is not finished," he said through the interpreter. "No," Harwood agreed. "It's not." The Soviets left. Morrison's hands shook so badly he could barely lower his rifle. Later, Morrison learned what the Soviet major had said to the commissar. A translator from regimental headquarters had been positioned 100 yards away with binoculars and a directional microphone, American intelligence gathering evidence for the reports that would justify Captain Harwood's actions to senior command. The major had said, "These Americans are fools, but they are armed fools with 3 divisions backing them and direct communication to Eisenhower. We kill them. We create an international incident that derails the occupation before it begins. Let the politicians handle it. We have enough enemies, without making more." Pragmatism had saved them. Not justice, not morality. Pure political calculation by a Soviet officer who understood that starting a firefight on the day of German surrender would complicate everyone's lives in ways that no NKVD commissar could fix. Morrison found this revelation oddly comforting. It suggested that even in systems built on terror, individuals could make choices that prioritized survival over ideology. It suggested that the space for human decency was narrow, but not yet eliminated entirely. If this story surprised you the way it surprises most people who learn about it, if it challenged your assumptions about how the end of World War II actually unfolded, hit the like button. These forgotten moments of moral courage deserve to be remembered. Now let's continue. Over the next 3 weeks, Company C processed 7,200 refugees through their improvised system. The numbers were tracked by a quartermaster sergeant named Douglas Miller, who kept 3 sets of books. 1 official record showing minimal refugee traffic, 1 classified record showing actual numbers for American command, and 1 private record with names and stories that he swore he would never submit to any authority. Miller was 34, old for an enlisted man. He had been an accountant in Chicago before the war. He understood that numbers were political. Every figure told a story, and the story changed depending on who was reading the ledger. "We're saving lives by lying," he told Morrison one evening as they reviewed the day's paperwork. "I never thought I'd be proud of false accounting." Morrison said nothing. He had stopped thinking about the morality of their actions in clear terms. The categories of right and wrong seemed inadequate for situations where following orders meant death and disobeying orders meant survival. He operated now in a space beyond judgment, a space where you simply did the next necessary thing and hoped God or history would sort out the ethical implications later. On May 23rd, the political situation shifted. The Allied Control Council issued new directives regarding displaced persons. The language was bureaucratic, the implications profound. Forced repatriation was officially discouraged for civilians and prisoners of war who had legitimate fears of persecution based on political belief or ethnic origin. The loophole was narrow, the interpretation was subjective, but it was enough. Captain Harwood received a commendation for his exemplary handling of complex refugee situations during the transition to occupation governance. The commendation made no mention of boats in the night or bureaucratic delays or Soviet commissars threatening violence. It spoke of diplomatic sensitivity and humanitarian consideration and adherence to the highest principles of American military conduct. Morrison received nothing. Sergeants rarely receive commendations for following orders their captains never officially gave. But on June 2nd, a package arrived at the Company C command post. It was wrapped in newspaper and tied with string. Inside was a silver pocket watch engraved with the initials H.A. A note accompanied it, written in careful English. Heinrich Adler died on May 9th. He died believing justice still existed. Thank you for allowing him that belief. His daughter, Ava. Morrison kept the watch. He carried it through the occupation, through demobilization, through the ship ride home across the Atlantic. He carried it for 63 years until his own death in 2008, and in his will he left it to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum with a note explaining its origin. The museum accepted the donation. The watch is not on public display. It sits in the archives, cataloged and preserved, testimony to a moment when ordinary men chose conscience over command and saved thousands of lives their allies demanded they surrender. The broader story of the 69th Infantry Division's actions at the Elbe remained classified until 1991. The documents were released as part of a general declassification of World War II operational records following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Historians barely noticed. The files contain nothing scandalous, no smoking guns, just page after page of routine reports describing refugee processing procedures and demarcation line disputes. But buried in those pages were the names of men like Morrison and Harwood and Wilkins. Buried in those pages were statistics showing that between April 25th and June 1st, 1945, the 69th Infantry Division took custody of 12,400 German civilians and military personnel at the Elbe crossing points. Of those 12,400, fewer than 80 were subsequently transferred to Soviet custody. The rest disappeared into the American occupation zone, processed through a system designed to delay and deflect until circumstances made forced repatriation politically impossible. 12,400 lives. That number exists in the archives. It is documented, verified, indisputable. What is not documented is how many of those people survived because of the delay, how many avoided Soviet labor camps where mortality rates exceeded 50%, how many avoided summary execution as suspected war criminals or collaborators, how many avoided disappearing into the vast machinery of Stalinist repression that consumed millions in the years after the war. The number is unknowable, but it is not zero. If you want to hear more stories about the moments when ordinary people made extraordinary choices in impossible circumstances, stories that official history tends to forget or minimize, subscribe to this channel. Because the past is full of these moments, and they deserve to be remembered. Now let's finish this story. Morrison returned to Philadelphia in November 1945. He found work as a machinist. He married. He had 3 children. He rarely spoke about the war except in the vaguest terms: Europe, combat, surrender, home. His wife learned not to ask questions when he woke at night, shaking, whispering German phrases she could not understand. In 1963, a letter arrived at his home. It was postmarked from Munich. The return address listed a name Morrison did not recognize, Klaus Bergman. The letter was in English. Dear Sergeant Morrison, you do not know me, but in April 1945, you helped my mother and me cross the Elbe River. I was 7 years old. My mother told me the American soldier's name was Morrison, and he had kind eyes. Even though he looked so tired, I thought he might fall down. I am writing to tell you that I am alive. I am married. I have 2 daughters. I teach mathematics at the university. I exist because you violated orders and helped us reach the American zone. I do not know if this letter will reach you. I do not know if you want to be reminded of those days. But I needed you to know that the choice you made mattered. It mattered to me. It mattered to my mother, who lived until 1959, and spoke of you often. It mattered to my daughters, who exist because their father was given a chance to survive. Thank you. Klaus Bergman. Morrison read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the same box where he kept Heinrich Adler's watch. He never responded. He did not know what to say. How do you explain to someone that you had simply done the next necessary thing and hoped it was enough? But other letters came. Over the years, Morrison received 47 letters from people who had crossed the Elbe in the spring of 1945. They arrived sporadically, sometimes years apart, sometimes several in a single month. Each letter told a variation of the same story: survival, gratitude, the impossible weight of knowing that your existence depended on someone else's decision to bend or break rules designed to prevent exactly what happened. Morrison kept all 47 letters. He never responded to any of them, but he kept them. In 2007, a historian from Georgetown University named Dr. Rebecca Stern was researching displaced persons policies at the end of World War II. She stumbled across the 69th Infantry Division files and noticed the statistical anomaly: 12,400 refugees processed, fewer than 80 repatriated. The numbers made no sense given the strict Allied agreements about repatriation. She tracked down surviving veterans. Most were dead, some could not remember, others remembered but would not speak. Then she found Frank Morrison, 84 years old, living in a nursing home outside Philadelphia with advanced Parkinson's disease that made his hands shake constantly. She interviewed him for 3 hours. He spoke slowly, the words fighting through medication and neurological deterioration and 62 years of silence. He told her about the boats, about the woman with the dead child, about Captain Harwood standing on the western bank with 30 men facing 200 Soviet soldiers, about Heinrich Adler's daughter and Klaus Bergman's letter, and the weight of knowing that bureaucratic delay had transformed into survival for thousands of human beings. When he finished, Dr. Stern asked him one question: "Why did you do it?" Morrison's shaking hands folded together on the table between them. His voice was barely audible. "Because they asked. And we could. And if not us, then who?" The answer was insufficient. Morrison knew it even as he spoke. Dr. Stern knew it. The question demanded moral philosophy, historical analysis, psychological insight into the decision-making processes that allow ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of courage or compassion. But Morrison had no philosophy to offer. He had been a 26-year-old sergeant who saw suffering and possessed the temporary authority to alleviate it. The equation was that simple and that complicated. Dr. Stern published her findings in the Journal of Military History in 2008. The article was titled "Discretion at the Demarcation Line: American Military Personnel and Refugee Protection at the Elbe, April to June 1945. It was academically rigorous, carefully footnoted, and utterly ignored by mainstream historical discourse. The story did not fit established narratives about the end of World War II. It complicated the clean lines between victor and defeated, between following orders and moral action, between Allied unity and Allied tensions. The article exists. The files exist. The watch exists in the museum archives. Frank Morrison died on March 14, 2008, 3 months after Dr. Stern's interview. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer mentioned his military service in one sentence. It made no mention of the Elbe, the refugees, or the choice that defined the most significant 6 weeks of his life. This is how history works. Not through grand narratives and decisive battles and clear moral victories, but through accumulated small choices made by people whose names appear nowhere except in declassified files and academic journals nobody reads. The story of the 69th Infantry Division at the Elbe is important, not because it changed the course of the war, it did not, but because it reveals something true about how human beings navigate impossible ethical situations. The men of Company C had options. They could have followed orders strictly and handed refugees to Soviet authorities. They could have closed the crossing point entirely and avoided the problem. They could have justified either action through military necessity, political reality, or simple exhaustion after months of combat. Instead, they chose the difficult path. They chose delay, obfuscation, creative bureaucracy, and the willingness to face diplomatic consequences. They chose this not because they were heroes or saints or unusually moral individuals, but because they saw suffering they could alleviate and possessed temporary authority to act. That choice matters. It matters because it demonstrates that even in systems designed to eliminate individual agency, space exists for human decency. It matters because it shows that following orders is a choice, not an inevitability. It matters because 12,400 people survived who might otherwise have died, and survival is never a footnote. On April 25, 2020, 75 years after the meeting at Torgau, a memorial was erected on the western bank of the Elbe. It was a small monument funded by private donations from the families of refugees who had crossed in 1945. The inscription was in 3 languages, English, German, and Russian. It read, "Here, in the spring of 1945, American soldiers of the 69th Infantry Division chose conscience over command. This memorial honors their courage and commemorates the thousands of lives they saved." 17 people attended the dedication ceremony. Most were elderly. Several required wheelchairs. One woman, 92 years old, spoke briefly. Her name was Margarete Bergman. She was Klaus Bergman's daughter, the granddaughter of the 7-year-old boy who crossed the Elbe on a pontoon boat operated by a tired sergeant from Philadelphia. "I exist because of a choice someone made," she said. "My children exist because of that choice. My grandchildren exist because of that choice. We are here because in a moment of darkness, someone chose light. That is all. That is everything." The monument stands today. It is not on any tourist maps. It does not appear in standard World War II tour itineraries, but it exists, a small stone marker on a riverbank where history took a different path because ordinary men decided that orders were not absolute and compassion was not weakness. The story of the 69th Infantry Division at the Elbe is not a story about American exceptionalism or military heroism or the triumph of democracy over totalitarianism. It is a simpler story about individuals who possessed power and chose to use it for mercy rather than efficiency. Frank Morrison carried Heinrich Adler's watch for 63 years. He kept 47 letters from people he saved. He never spoke publicly about his actions. When historians finally discovered the story, he offered no grand explanations, no philosophical justifications, no claims of moral superiority. He simply said, "Because they asked, and we could, and if not us, then who?" That answer contains everything: the admission of agency, the acknowledgement of capability, the question that transforms passive observation into active responsibility. If not us, then who? the question that every person faces in moments when suffering is visible and power is available, and the choice between action and inaction defines not just individual character, but collective humanity. Morrison answered that question by loading boats. Harwood answered it by facing down a commissar. Company C answered it by becoming expert at creative bureaucracy. 12,400 refugees answered it by surviving. The watch sits in museum archives. The letters exist in private collections. The monument stands on the riverbank. The story remains largely unknown. But the choice they made, the choice to prioritize human life over military convenience, to risk consequences for compassion, to use temporary authority for permanent mercy, that choice reverberates through generations. Margaret Bergman exists because of it. Her children exist because of it. Their children exist because of it. The number of people alive today because of decisions made at the Elbe River in the spring of 1945 is incalculable. They live, they work, they love, they exist. And existence, in the end, is the only monument that matters. The truth about what happened at the Elbe did not emerge cleanly or completely. Archives opened slowly. Veterans died before they could be interviewed. Documents were classified, declassified, reclassified based on diplomatic considerations that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. The story emerged in fragments. A personnel file here, a refugee testimony there, statistical anomalies that made careful researchers pause and investigate further. Dr. Rebecca Stern's article was not the first attempt to document the 69th Division's actions. In 1978, a West German journalist named Hans Müller published a book titled Forgotten Crossings: Refugee Stories from the Final Days. The book contained interviews with 43 refugees who had crossed the Elbe in American-controlled sectors during April and May 1945. The stories were consistent. American soldiers who operated boats in darkness, American officers who lost paperwork, American medics who found medical reasons to delay transfers, American supply sergeants who discovered ration shortages that required immediate distribution to civilians rather than proper accounting through military channels. Muller's book sold 2,000 copies. It was not translated into English. It went out of print in 1981. But the testimony it contained provided the first documentary evidence that what happened at the Elbe was not isolated incident, but systematic policy, unofficial, unauthorized, and absolutely deliberate. One interview stood out. A woman named Helga Schmidt described crossing the Elbe on April 27th. She had been a schoolteacher in Dresden. The firebombing had destroyed her home. The Soviet occupation of her neighborhood had convinced her that survival required flight westward. She reached the Elbe with her 2 sons, ages 9 and 11, and no possessions except the clothes they wore. The American soldier who put us in the boat was crying, she told Muller, not sobbing, just tears running down his face while he worked. He said nothing. He just kept loading people. When the boat was full, he pushed us off and immediately started loading the next one. I looked back and saw him standing there in the darkness with tears on his face, and I realized he understood exactly what he was doing. He understood the risk. He understood the consequences. He was choosing to help us anyway. Schmidt survived. Both her sons survived. One became a doctor. The other became an engineer. Between them, they had 7 children. Those 7 children had 19 children. The family tree that began with a crying American soldier loading a pontoon boat in darkness now includes 43 people across 4 generations. 43 people who exist because someone cried while working. The emotional cost of those decisions remained largely undocumented. Morrison spoke to Dr. Stern about the physical exhaustion, the sleepless nights, the rope burns, the constant fear of Soviet retaliation, but he did not speak about the psychological toll of choosing who got on the boats first, who was wounded enough to take priority, which families could be separated temporarily, which German soldiers in uniform were Wehrmacht conscripts, and which might be SS officers lying about their service. Every choice carried weight. Every decision meant someone else waited longer. The boats held finite numbers. The time available was finite. The American willingness to bend rules was finite. Within those constraints, Morrison and men like him made hundreds of micro-decisions that determined fates. He did not speak about this. The letters he received never mentioned it. The official record certainly did not document it. But the weight of those choices lived in Morrison's shaking hands, in his nightmares, in his inability to explain to his wife why certain German phrases made him wake in terror. Private Eddie Wilkins returned to Kentucky after the war. He became a Baptist minister. His sermons rarely mentioned the war directly, but his theology was shaped by what he had witnessed at the Elbe. He preached about mercy as action rather than feeling, about faith measured in willingness to risk consequences for conscience, about grace as the space between what law demands and what humanity requires. His congregation of 47 people in a small town outside Lexington had no idea their pastor's understanding of grace had been forged while ferrying German refugees across a river in darkness. Wilkins never told them. He carried that knowledge privately until his death in 1993, and his funeral sermon made no mention of pontoon boats or Soviet commissars or the 47 people who sat in pews listening to theology they did not know was testimony. Captain James Harwood returned to Iowa. He resumed teaching high school history. His students learned about World War II through textbooks that made no mention of the Elbe crossing points, of refugee processing delays, of junior officers who used bureaucratic creativity to save lives their governments had agreed to surrender. In 1968, a student asked Harwood what he had done during the war. Harwood paused for a long moment. Then he said, "I followed orders when they were right. I delayed following orders when they were wrong. The difference between those two things is what defines civilization." The student did not understand. He was 17 years old in 1968, and the question of when to follow orders and when to resist them was very much alive in American culture. But Harwood offered no elaboration. The bell rang. The class moved on to the Marshall Plan. Years later, that student who became a lawyer, who specialized in refugee and asylum law, who spent his career arguing that legal protection should extend to people fleeing persecution regardless of which government claimed jurisdiction, realized that Harwood had been teaching a lesson that went far beyond the curriculum. The lesson had taken 30 years to fully comprehend. The Soviet response to the 69th Division's actions was muted but persistent. Official protests were filed through diplomatic channels. The language was formal, the accusations clear. American military personnel had violated the Yalta Agreement, had interfered with Soviet jurisdiction, had harbored potential war criminals, had undermined Allied unity at a critical moment. The American response was equally formal and equally clear. All actions taken by the 69th Infantry Division were consistent with Geneva Convention obligations, American military law, and humanitarian principles that superseded temporary occupation agreements. Any German personnel in American custody would be processed according to established protocols. Transfer to Soviet authority would occur only when proper documentation was provided and individual status was verified. The bureaucratic dance continued for months. The Soviets demanded immediate handover of specific individuals. The Americans requested documentation of charges. The Soviets provided lists. The Americans found discrepancies. The Soviets amended lists. The Americans discovered administrative errors. Round and round, while the refugees in question moved deeper into American-controlled territory, found work, established residency, became facts on the ground rather than legal abstractions subject to diplomatic negotiation. By the time the Berlin blockade began in June 1948, the question of repatriation from the Elbe crossing points was functionally moot. The Cold War had transformed the political landscape. Refugees who had fled Soviet-controlled territory were now potential intelligence assets, propaganda victories, living testimony to the failures of communist occupation policy. The American government that had reluctantly tolerated the 69th Division's creative bureaucracy in 1945 now celebrated those same refugees as proof of American humanitarian superiority. The irony was not lost on Morrison. In 1950, he received a letter from the State Department thanking him for his valuable contribution to American psychological warfare efforts in Europe. The letter praised his foresight in protecting individuals who subsequently provided crucial intelligence regarding Soviet occupation practices. Morrison burned the letter. He wanted no recognition from a government that had retroactively justified actions it would have court-martialed him for if circumstances had been different. The refugees he had helped were not intelligence assets. They were human beings who had been terrified and starving, and he had possessed the temporary authority to help them, and he had made a choice. The choice was not strategic. It was not political. It was not calculated to advance American interests in an emerging Cold War. It was simply a choice to alleviate suffering when suffering was visible and power was available. That the choice later became politically convenient did not make it noble. It just made it fortunate. In 2012, researchers at the University of Heidelberg began a project to document the individual stories of refugees who had crossed from Soviet to American zones between April and August 1945. The project was called Zwischenwelten, Between Worlds. The research team identified 783 individuals who had verifiable documentation of crossing at 69th Infantry Division control points. Of those 783, 412 were still alive or had living descendants who could provide testimony. The testimonies formed a mosaic of experience. Some refugees remembered kindness. Soldiers who shared rations, medics who treated wounds, officers who spoke gently to terrified children. Others remembered efficiency, processing that was swift, thorough, focused solely on moving people westward as quickly as possible. A few remembered nothing. The crossing was a blur of exhaustion, fear, and relief that left no clear memories except the binary of before and after. But one pattern emerged consistently. Nearly every refugee interviewed mentioned a moment when they understood they were safe. Not legally safe, not officially safe, but humanly safe. The moment when an American soldier looked at them and saw a person rather than an enemy, a problem, a diplomatic complication. For Helga Schmidt, it was the crying soldier. For Klaus Bergmann's mother, it was Morrison writing down her son's name and promising to remember it. For Heinrich Adler's daughter, it was the moment Morrison said, "Get in the boat," without asking for documentation, verification, or proof of innocence. These moments were not policy. They were not systematic. They were individual human beings making individual human choices within a system that provided narrow space for humanity to operate. But that space existed. Men like Morrison and Harwood and Wilkins found it and used it. And 783 documented lives were saved as a result. The actual number was almost certainly higher. The Zwischenwelten project could only document refugees who had maintained records, who could prove they had crossed at specific locations on specific dates. But the refugee tide in the spring of 1945 was chaos. Thousands crossed without documentation. Thousands more were processed through systems designed to lose paperwork. The true number of lives saved will never be known, but 12,400 is the documented minimum. 12,400 people whose names appear in American military records. 12,400 people who passed through Company C control points and were not handed to Soviet authorities despite diplomatic agreements requiring exactly that transfer. 12,400 is not an estimate. It is not a projection. It is a number recorded by Sergeant Douglas Miller in ledgers he kept with accountant's precision. The number exists in archives. It can be verified. It represents the absolute documented minimum of lives saved by men who chose conscience over command. The actual number is higher. How much higher remains unknown. The question of whether the 69th Division's actions were legal remained contentious. International law scholars debated the interpretation of the Yalta Agreement, the Geneva Convention, and the various occupation protocols that governed Allied behavior in Germany after surrender. Some argued that Captain Harwood and his men had violated clear diplomatic agreements and undermined Allied unity at a critical moment. The Yalta Agreement had specifically addressed the return of displaced persons to their countries of origin. The Soviets had every right to expect American compliance. By obstructing that process, the 69th Division had created a diplomatic incident that poisoned Allied relations and contributed to Cold War tensions. Others argued that Geneva Convention protections for prisoners of war superseded bilateral agreements between Allied powers. German soldiers who had surrendered to American forces were entitled to treatment according to international humanitarian law. That law did not permit transfer to another power if such transfer would result in persecution, torture, or summary execution. The 69th Division had not violated agreements. They had upheld fundamental humanitarian principles against political expediency. The debate was academic. No courts-martial were ever convened. No disciplinary action was ever taken. No formal investigation ever occurred. The 69th Division's actions at the Elbe existed in historical record as accomplished fact rather than legal precedent. But the moral question remained. Morrison struggled with it for decades. The letters from refugees suggested he had done right. The State Department letter suggesting he had served American strategic interests made him doubt. The knowledge that some refugees he had helped might have been Wehrmacht soldiers who had committed atrocities in Russia created a different kind of weight. He had not asked questions. He had not verified innocence. He had simply seen people who were terrified and helped them escape. Some of those people might have deserved whatever fate awaited them in Soviet custody. Morrison would never know. He had made a choice to prioritize immediate mercy over abstract justice, and he lived with the consequences of that choice until his death. The consequences included 47 letters of gratitude. They also included nightmares in which he ferried SS officers across the Elbe while their victims watched from the eastern bank. Both were real. Both mattered. Morrison never resolved the tension between them. On December 17, 2019, a ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery. Frank Morrison's granddaughter, Emily Morrison Chen, donated Heinrich Adler's watch to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in a formal presentation attended by museum directors, military historians, and 3 refugees who had crossed the Elbe in 1945. One of those refugees was 96-year-old Werner Hoffmann. He had been a German soldier, wounded at Kustrin, who had shed his uniform and walked west with civilians fleeing Soviet advance. He reached the Elbe on May 1st. An American sergeant had looked at his wound, bandaged it with supplies from a medic's kit, and put him on a boat without asking questions. "I was Wehrmacht," Hoffmann told the assembled guests. "I fought on the Eastern Front. I saw things. I did things. I do not claim innocence. But the American soldier who helped me saw only a wounded man who needed help. He gave it. I do not know if I deserved that mercy, but I received it. And I spent 74 years trying to deserve it retroactively by living a life that honored the choice he made." Hoffmann had become a social worker after the war. He had specialized in helping refugees integrate into German society. First the refugees from East Germany, then the Turkish guest workers, then the Syrian refugees of recent decades. His career had been shaped entirely by the memory of an American sergeant who had chosen to help rather than judge. "I cannot undo what I did in Russia," Hoffmann said. "I cannot change my past, but I could change what my future became. That is what mercy does. It creates space for transformation. The soldier at the Elbe gave me that space. I tried to use it well." The audience was silent. The moral complexity of Hoffmann's testimony, gratitude from someone who might have been complicit in atrocities, redemption claimed through decades of service, the impossible question of whether mercy extended to the potentially guilty was justice or injustice, hung heavy in the winter air. Emily Morrison Chen stepped forward. She held Heinrich Adler's watch. "My grandfather never spoke about the war," she said. "He kept this watch for 63 years. He kept 47 letters from people he helped. He never responded to those letters. He never sought recognition. When a historian finally interviewed him, he gave the simplest answer to the most complex question. Because they asked, and we could. And if not us, then who?" She paused. The watch gleamed in her hand, silver, engraved, a gift from a dying judge who had believed justice could survive civilizational collapse. "That answer is not satisfying," Chen continued. "It does not resolve moral ambiguity. It does not provide clear guidance for impossible choices, but it does something more important. It acknowledges agency. It acknowledges capability. It acknowledges responsibility. My grandfather saw people suffering. He possessed temporary authority to help. He chose to help. The moral philosophy can be debated by scholars. The lived reality is that 12,400 people survived who might not have. That is not abstract. That is not theoretical. That is 12,400 human beings who lived. She handed the watch to the museum director. The watch joined the archives, one object among millions. Testimony to a moment when ordinary men chose mercy over efficiency and saved lives their governments had agreed to surrender. The legacy of the 69th Infantry Division's actions at the Elbe is complex. It cannot be reduced to simple heroism or straightforward moral victory. The men involved were not saints. They were exhausted soldiers who made choices in chaotic circumstances without clear guidance or certainty about consequences. Some of those choices saved lives that deserved saving. Some of those choices saved lives that perhaps did not. The refugees they helped included genuine victims of Nazi persecution. They also included German soldiers who had served a genocidal regime. They included civilians who had supported Hitler until supporting Hitler became dangerous. They included children who bore no responsibility for anything except being born German in the wrong place at the wrong time. Morrison helped all of them. He did not sort them into categories of deserving and undeserving. He simply saw suffering and possessed the temporary authority to alleviate it and made a choice. That choice was ethically messy. It violated clear agreements between Allied powers. It prioritized immediate mercy over systemic justice. It saved some people who probably should have faced consequences for their actions. It also saved 12,400 human beings. The number sits uncomfortably in historical consciousness. It is large enough to matter. It is small enough to seem insignificant against the backdrop of tens of millions dead in World War II. It represents both genuine humanitarian achievement and the limitations of individual action within systems designed to eliminate individual choice. But the number is real. The people it represents were real. They lived because men like Morrison chose to load boats instead of following orders. They had children. Those children had children. The generations cascade forward, each one existing because of a choice made in darkness on a riverbank in the spring of 1945. That is the legacy, not moral clarity, not simple heroism. Just the stubborn fact of continued existence spreading through time like ripples from a stone thrown into water. The ripples are still spreading. They will continue spreading as long as descendants of those refugees live and have children of their own. Morrison could not have imagined this legacy. He was 26 years old, operating on exhaustion and instinct, and a simple sense that leaving people to suffer when help was possible was wrong. The philosophical implications, the historical significance, the generational impact, none of that existed in his mind as he loaded the boats. He simply did the next necessary thing. 63 years later, dying in a nursing home in Philadelphia, he told Dr. Stern the only truth he knew, because they asked, and we could. And if not us, then who? The answer contains everything. The admission that suffering makes demands on those who witness it. The acknowledgement that capability creates responsibility. The question that transforms passive observation into active choice. If not us, then who? Everyone faces that question eventually, in small ways and large ways, in moments that seem insignificant and moments that define lives. The question is always the same. If not us, then who? Morrison answered it by loading boats. His answer saved 12,400 lives and created ripples that spread through generations. Your answer, when the question comes, and it always comes, will create its own ripples. The choice is yours. The responsibility is yours. The question waits for everyone. If not us, then who?